One of my favorite movies is called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. It stars Jimmy Stewart and John Wayne. It's a movie they made very late in their careers. The movie begins with an elderly senator, Jimmy Stewart, going back to a small frontier town to take part in the funeral of an old derelict gunfighter, John Wayne. A newspaper reporter approaches him and asks him, what's an important man like him doing here, particularly dealing with this funeral for no account? And Jimmy Stewart proceeds to tell him the story of his beginnings in the West as a simple country lawyer and how he was challenged by a bully outlaw in the area, Liberty Valance, beaten up, bullied, harassed, until finally, in a classic Western shootout, he supposedly kills Liberty Valance and brings law and order to the West, which leads to his meteoric rise to political importance in the nation. As he tells the story, he makes it clear that the things that everybody believes about him are not true. That in fact, it's the John Wayne character who did most of those things and who really is the hero of the story. When the movie ends, the newspaper reporter throws his notes into the local stove and says, when fact and legend collide, you should always print the legend. Well, that's really the case of small-town histories across America. It's the legends that drive those local histories. And it's true in Westfield also. What you want to remember is that most town historians, most local history, is really not written by historians. The history of Westfield is written by 4 people. The first of them was Emerson Davis, who was pastor of the First Congregational Church. He died around the time of the Civil War. The second was Joseph Bartlett, who was a newspaper reporter who died about 1900. The third was Lewis Dewey, who was an amateur genealogist. He died in the 1930s. And the fourth was John Lockwood, who was pastor of the First Congregational Church, and his history of the town was written in the 1920s. These men were antiquarians, not historians. They recorded grandfather legends. You know, my grandmother told me there's an enormous amount of that in every family, every town, every community. And that's really what lays at the basis of most of the popular history of Westfield, Massachusetts. For instance, General Shepard. There's a statue of him in the center of town. The trouble is, he wasn't a general in the Revolutionary War. He was a captain. Now remember, a captain is a very lowly officer. In fact, by 1776, he turned in his resignation because he said if he couldn't advance any further than captain, he was going to quit and go home. George Washington promotes him to lieutenant colonel. By the way, the Westfield Athenaeum has a copy of that promotion in George Washington's hand. After the Revolution, when Shepard came back to Westfield to settle down, he was involved in a very famous episode of the suppression of the Shays' Rebellion. At that point in time, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts appointed him a general of militia for a brief period of time. That's how he becomes General William Shepard. Also, Shepard was not a friend of Washington. There's a very strong legend in town that he was a close friend of George Washington's, that Washington, in fact, visited him here in Westfield we have in Upper Western Avenue a property known sometimes as the Washington Tavern. It's more commonly known as Sackett's Tavern. It's owned by John Davies today. George Washington was never here. He was never a friend of Shepard. You want to remember, George Washington was an aristocratic Virginian who basically looked down his nose at almost all New Englanders. And he had even people of his own class and background were not personal friends of George Washington. Washington always kept a standoffish image. He certainly wasn't the friend of a lowly lieutenant colonel of a minor regiment. In fact, Shepard wasn't even a hero in town, even though we've got a statue of him on the green. Because of the Shays' Rebellion, Shepard represented the national centralizing forces, and Westfield opposed it. In fact, during Shays' Rebellion, remember, it's Shepard who goes and fires cannon into the Shayite Rebellion people, and many of them were from Westfield. He was so opposed by his neighbors that he wrote a pleading letter to General Knox, who was the Secretary of War for President Washington, asking for help because his neighbors were burning down his fences. They'd put the eyes out of his horses. They called in his debts and were trying to drive him out of town. It's interesting that on the 200th anniversary celebrations of Westfield in 1869, when many of Shepard's descendants still lived in town, and there were elderly people in town who remembered Shepard, that Shepard's name plays almost no part in the celebrations. It's not until 1919, on the 300th anniversary of the town, that suddenly Shepard is discovered as the great national hero, and he is General Shepard with his statue on the green. Oh, by the way, there's a lot of talk about why Shepard's statue faces down Broad Street. There are various interpretations. The main one is that if you're going to put a statue on the green at that time, the trolley turnaround was on the north side of the green. There were buildings on the east and west side of the green. The south side of the green was the only place you could put it. Secondly, it probably was important that at that point in time, all of the major families of Westfield lived on Broad Street, and the chairman of the board of the celebration in 1919, his home was where the Big Y shopping plaza is at the end of the street, and the statue looks down the street directly at his home. Another example of this that comes from the Revolutionary War era is the great patriotism, DAR and all of that, of New Englanders about the Revolution. Westfield doesn't really fit very well. Now, it is true that Huck Lamb, who did a research on trying to identify all the Revolutionary veterans in town and came up with 300 of them, the fact of the matter is that almost all of that 300 were 30-day militiamen. Very few members of the Westfield community were soldiers in the Continental Army. That is, people who signed up and committed to fighting. A militiaman who's called out for 30 days, by the time he's walked to the border of Westfield, his 30 days are pretty nearly up. And I can tell you from the histories of the Revolutionary War that Washington and other Continental officers complained continuously about militiamen who would leave right in the middle of battles because their time was up. Westfield citizens also voted against the Constitution of the United States when it came up for a vote in the 1780s. They also voted against the new Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which created democracy. They were against it. you're going to see that from Westfield people in the Revolution War, the Civil War, and World War I. Essentially, people in Westfield just want to be left alone. They don't want any part in national politics and national issues. Another example from the Revolutionary era, one of the great treasures of the archives of Westfield is a piece of a cast bronze bell that is claimed to be the Revere bell, a bell that was cast for the first church and eventually was moved to the academy. And when the academy burned in the 1890s, the bell fell and was destroyed, and pieces were picked up and saved reverently in Westfield. Yes, there was a Revere bell. But in 1871, the citizens of Westfield, who had complained ever since they had purchased the Revere bell that they didn't like its tone, sold it and replaced it with a bell from the Troy Bell Manufacturing Company. They got rid of the Revere bell. There was no great reverence for Paul Revere. Westfield Canal? Oh yes, there was a canal in Westfield. The famous Farmington Canal or New Haven, Northampton Canal ran right through the center of Westfield. The trouble was the canal was a failure. It came to town in 1829. It was extended to Northampton in the early 1830s. And by 1841, it was closed. In fact, the canal really only functioned from 1835 to 1841. And there were only 2 canal boats a week that went between Northampton and New Haven. Now, it's true that those canal boats did bring goods into and out of town, but the canal only functioned during a brief period of time each year when there was enough water to float the canal boats. It couldn't function during the winter. During the fall, there usually wasn't enough water available for it. So just a few brief months that the boats could actually travel. And even then, the local farmers along the canal regularly dug holes in the canal bank to let the water out. You see, the canal company had gotten the rights from the state to take the land by eminent domain, so the canal cut right through farmers' fields. Westfield farmers didn't like that. As we get into the middle part of the 19th century, there are more and more of these myths. One that I used to run into regularly in the years in which I worked in the archives at Westfield were citizens who'd come up to me to let me know that they had just recently moved into one of the homes on the Underground Railroad, that they knew that they found in their cellar chains against the walls or secret rooms. The trouble is, there's very little evidence that the Underground Railroad ever actually functioned in Westfield. Now, there is some minor evidence about 3 people and 3 houses in Westfield. Hiram Hull, the whip manufacturer, had a home on Franklin Street that is associated with the Underground Railroad. The Mosley family had a farmhouse on Union Street that is mentioned. But the most details are about the Spellman family on School Street. Those of you who may have seen the children's book, Deborah Remembers, may remember that there's a very significant chapter in there about the Underground Railroad and children who were hidden in the Spellman house. The problem with this is that all of this memory, all of this history is based on a single limited source. In 1900, the Springfield newspapers ran a series of articles on the Underground Railroad in the Connecticut River Valley. And it was very strong in the Connecticut River Valley. Springfield was a major center of abolitionist activity. There are 4 paragraphs in that multi-day article, 4 paragraphs, quoting the son of Hiram Hull, who is reminiscing about events 50 years earlier when he was a child. That's the sole source for the Underground Railroad in Westfield. There is no other. What there is some facts about how Westfield responded to the whole great struggle of abolition and the Civil War in America. In 1856, an anti-immigrant, anti-black, anti-abolitionist movement known as the Know Nothing Party captured much of the politics of the Northeast of the United States. They swept literally all the political offices in Massachusetts. This Know Nothing Party was violently anti-abolitionist. There were attacks on abolitionist speakers in Westfield. In fact, the Wyben Schoolhouse was burned down after an abolitionist speaker, appeared there one night. The normal school students had a speaker, and they were soundly condemned in the Westfield newspapers for it. In the 1860 election, Lincoln did win about 50% of the votes in Westfield. However, Bell and Breckinridge, the 2 political parties representing Southern slave owners, carried 25% of the vote in town. The largest majority that Bell and Breckinridge received anywhere in the Northeast. In the 1864 election, Lincoln did only slightly better. George McClellan, who ran in the Democratic ticket and ran on a ticket which called for the immediate cessation of the Civil War and letting the South go, carried 48% of the vote in town. In fact, McClellan won the surrounding small towns of Southwick, Montgomery, Blandford, and Tolland. This simply continued the Western Mass approach to things in national politics. This is not a center of patriotism. It's a center of leave me alone. Civil War patriotism. We've got a Civil War statue. Huck Lamb also, in his attempt to identify all veterans of all wars in Westfield, did another research collection and where he identified 500 people, 500 men whose names are associated with serving in the Civil War. Not only did he collect the names, but he also collected the service records. I've gone through those service records, and in fact, of the 506 names that he found, only 388 actually left Westfield for any service. Now, Westfield had a population of about 6,000 people during the Civil War. It had roughly 1,500 to 1,800 adult males who were eligible to serve. Over 100 of that 506 were not originally men from Westfield. They were men assigned to Westfield. Now, there were 77 men from this Westfield group who lost their lives in the Civil War. However, 2/3 of them did not lose their lives in combat, but lost their lives to disease. So in fact, in the most bloody war that America ever participated in. It's generally estimated that America lost more lives in the Civil War than all the rest of the wars combined. The 6,000 population of Westfield may, in fact, have had less than 24 combat casualties. Westfield men rushed to the colors the first 6 months of the war, and after that, it was the draft that brought them in. Even then, there are a large number of desertions listed in Westfield's 506 men. There are a number of other smaller myths and legends. One that sometimes pops up is the famous Counterfeiters Cave on Toccoa Mountain. It's regularly accounted that early in the 19th century, counterfeiters had a cave, and there are stories about federal agents here and people being arrested. The entire single source for this legend, and by the way, there is no cave on Toccoa Mountain to begin with, the entire source for this legend is a little over one-page article in Stephen Petoniak's self-published History of Westfield. And in a footnote to the article, he says that the names are fictitious. That's the source of the Counterfeiters Cave story. Westfield has a green at its center. We're told that it saw cattle marketing, street fairs, and most particularly, like other famous greens in New England villages, it was the place for the trooping of the town's militia on militia's days. No, never happened. First of all, the Westfield Green in the center of what is today the center of town was a pond hole. It was not a green. In the 1830s, H.B. Smith, who ran a combination bookstore, fruit market, etc., before he got into the manufacturing of heavy industrial furnaces, H.B. Smith created a citizens committee to fill in the swampy center of town. We didn't have a green with a traffic circle around it because a green was there. We had a traffic circle around it because it was a wet hole. And he set up a city's citizens committee to get all the businesses and houses around the green to dump their ashes and junk in the center to fill it up. When the cobblestones were laid in the mid-19th century, the assembled dirt was excavated in the streets of town and also piled in the center, and then they planted trees. Therefore, we got a green. Oh, by the way, we did have a town militia in colonial days, and it did have training days. It trained in the train field. If you look at early maps of Westfield, you'll discover the train field. It's on the north side of the Westfield River, off Pochassek Street. Now, the railroad tracks of the Boston and Albany Railroad run right through that train field today. And most people, it appears on maps to this day as the train field, but most people think it's called the train field because the train runs through the field. The railroad train, that is. No, it was the training field for the militia. You had to be away from the center of town so the militia could fire their guns. There was another field in town that was used for celebrations a little later. We have written accounts that it was on between Holland Avenue and the streets north of it. We have accounts, including one that describes General Shepard in his old age coming down to observe the militia training there. But they didn't train in the center of town. There's another more common legend in town, one of which has made various entrepreneurs money. That's the legend of the black squirrels. We have people who sell various artifacts with black squirrels on them. One business in town, Connor's store, produced a whole line of black squirrel merchandise. The legend is that Frank Stanley Beveridge, the founder of the Stanley Home Products Corporation and the beneficiary of Stanley Park to the community, that he was from Canada. And the legend is that one day he was going through town and he was so impressed by the flower baskets on the bridges that he thought this was a nice, pleasant town and that he would come and settle here. Well, I don't know whether that story is true or not, but the second story about him I know isn't true. It's said that after he settled here in town and created his farm on Upper Western Avenue, the farm later became Stanley Park, that he was lonesome for his home in Canada, in Ontario. And one of the features of that home in Ontario was black squirrels. So that some of his employees made a trip to Canada, captured some of the black squirrels, brought them back and released them on the farm. And the famous black squirrels in Westfield, and there are many here in Westfield, resulted from that introduction. I, in fact, have had descendants of people who worked for the Stanley Foundation, the Stanley factory, tell me assuredly that it was their father who did it. Well, I don't know what, in fact, some individuals did about bringing black squirrels here, but I do know two facts. One, there are only two kinds of squirrels. There are gray squirrels and there are red squirrels. Black squirrels are a natural mutation of gray squirrels. Black squirrels exist among gray squirrel populations wherever gray squirrel populations are dominant. Therefore, you find black squirrels in the Upper Michigan Peninsula, for instance. You find them in Ontario. And in the 1870s, you found them in Westfield. 80 years before Frank Stanley Beveridge ever came to town. There are newspaper accounts describing the black squirrels in Westfield in the 1870s and 80s. They were rare enough then that when one was shot by a local hunter, they would be brought into the newspaper editor's office to be shown to him, and there would be a little news story about a black squirrel. Frank Stanley Beveridge may have liked black squirrels, but he's not responsible for them in Westfield. These are some of the most prominent legends of Westfield. I've been talking about the facts behind them for decades, and it hasn't changed any of them at all. People still strongly believe most of them. And that's probably all right. A good legend is an important part of every family's history, every community's history. In fact, legends are in the process of creation all the time. There is a legend that is in the process of being created now. It's not a particularly nice legend, but it's how legends are created. In the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a new wave of immigration into Westfield, particularly from the breakup of the Soviet Union, and an increasing Hispanic migration also. This has led to subtle underground murmuring about the new immigrants and what they offer to the community and the burdens they bring in to the community. The essence is something like this. When my family came here, they weren't given all this free stuff. They had to work for it. What it simply means is most people don't know that here in the archives of the Westfield Athenaeum, we have some interesting records. For one, we have the annual reports of the town going back into the very early 1800s, and in those annual reports each year was a list of all the, quote, welfare, unquote, although they didn't call it that in those days, that was given to the citizens of town, often by name. It lists doctor's bills, grocery bills, bills for food, for coal, for wood. This amounted to thousands of dollars, a significant percentage of the town's taxes every year went for public subsistence. In addition, the town ran a, quote, poor farm, unquote. That was housing out on Route 20, across from the Toccoa Country Club. Some of the buildings are still there. They're called the Toccoa Apartments, in which any mostly elderly person who no longer could take care of themselves was housed at the public expense. We have the accounts, some of the accounts of that farm, that lists people by name, how long they were there, and how much it cost to support them. In addition, the churches provided those local benefits. You can see by looking at the records of the town that even though people sometimes weren't happy about it, Westfield has always provided a level of support for those among them who couldn't help themselves. It was here from the beginning. It's here today. It hasn't changed. Just the names have changed. Westfield also was the home of Klan and anti-Klan activities in the 20s and 30s. It's part of the town history that's pushed aside. But when the Klan was powerful in America in the 1920s, it was very, very powerful here in Western Massachusetts. It's part of the myths of the community that it didn't happen here. It did. Myths and legends, then, will continue. They're part of what makes us unique, the part of which gives our history some excitement, and so they will continue generation after generation as facts are supplanted by legends.